Welcome to the National Fantasy Pregame Show, brought to you by Nolan Ryan Beef Jerky, the official beef jerky of the Major League Clubhouse Managers. Available at Kroger's and Amazon.com. Also brought to you by Fantistics and InsiderFootball.com and MyFantasyFix.com. That's where Michael Waldo is from. I'm Lou Blassie. We're also from Fantistics, and you may know us from SiriusXM Fantasy Sports Radio as well. Hi, Michael. How you doing?
Hey, Lou. I'm doing really well. How are you doing?
Good to be back. Good to be working together again. Thanks for covering last week.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back. Going solo is good, but man, it nothing compares to having two people to banter back and forth with.
All right, we break up these podcasts during the week, and this is the Week 6 podcast. We break them up by quarterback, which we're doing right now. We also have a running back podcast and the tight end and wide receivers podcast. So head on over to the National Fantasy Pregame Show. Give us a like because you'll know when we post them. First of all, it'll be up on your feed as soon as they're posted. And check out the other videos, the other podcasts on the National Fantasy Pregame Show. Head on over and check it out. Quarterbacks this week in Week 6. We have bye weeks to contend with. I'm a little frustrated on my season-long team because I'm a Tom Brady guy. And, Tom Brady's performance has been all over the place this year.
Yeah, he has. But he continues to be priced up. And, all quarterbacks really, Lou, have kind of been all over the place. Aaron Rodgers obviously has been a consistent play week in, week out. But for the most part, there really hasn't been that grouping of elite top quarterbacks in the league. Everybody's been kind of up and down. But, yeah, like you said, this week, a lot of bye weeks to deal with. And then, just when we think we can get a consistent Cam Newton going up against a really good matchup in Philadelphia, he gets the Thursday night game. So he's not going to be in the, able to be rostered in the main slate on either FanDuel or DraftKings. If you wanted to play that Thursday through Monday slate, I think he's a great option. He's still priced down quite a bit. And, Philadelphia has given up the second most points per game through the year to begin the season. So, I think Cam's a great play there. But if you're talking on the main slate, you talked about Tom Brady. He's probably the main top guy that is going to be available. Aaron Rodgers is in a difficult matchup in Minnesota. So, you don't have a clear-cut play that screams, hey, you have to roster this guy. So I think we might see ownership spread out a little bit more than we usually do on a given week.
It's Philadelphia you talked about is giving up the second most targets per game at 38.8 behind Tampa Bay, who everybody's been throwing on. How dependent, rank by our podcasts, which are quarterback and then a running back podcast and wide receivers and tight ends, where do the quarterbacks rank in terms of you dealing with the matchup? How big does the matchup play in the quarterback selection?
Oh, it's huge. I think especially team. If you're talking a team matchup, they're definitely number one. Quarterback matchup is integral, and when you're talking cash game play, you really want to focus your attention on the quarterback position. It's very important in cash games. In tournaments, the quarterback position does not matter quite as much, and I'm less worried about it from a matchup perspective too, because in tournaments, I kind of want to take a quarterback in a difficult matchup because I want to get a little bit lower ownership on them. But in cash games, it's very, very important, and I take it into account quite a bit. So I'd say from a cash game perspective, quarterbacks are probably number one, then running backs, then wide receivers.
On the GPP, you talked about you might want to get a little ownership advantage there with a quarterback that has a tough matchup, but that's not really the first place you're looking for separation in a GPP, right, at the quarterback position?
Yeah, what you use in a GPP at the quarterback position, you use as a way to save money, really, quite frankly. You want to take the quarterback who has the big upside, but maybe he's priced down, and whether or not he has a difficult matchup or not, you want to find the guy who could put up the big numbers. You don't want the game managers regardless, but if you find a guy who slings the ball around, Jay Cutler could have his day any given week. It's just the fact that you wouldn't trust him in cash games, but in tournaments, he could put up 3 touchdowns and 300 yards. So that's the type of difference there, is the fact that in tournaments, you're leveraging the quarterback position to save money, to be able to still get those high numbers of points. Whereas in cash games, you really want to just use the quarterback position to get steady results.
Do you ever play on the GPP on the tournament side? Do you ever wheel quarterbacks? In other words, would you come up with a couple of value quarterbacks and take a lineup and wheel them around with a different quarterback?
I'm not sure I know what you mean. Can you explain?
For example, with baseball GPP lineups, you might wheel a starting pitcher in there. You might use the same lineup and hope for a starting pitcher. Would you do that with the quarterback position, or is the quarterback position not the best place to make that kind of strategy move?
No, I think you could. Typically, the way Lou, and this might be a good time to talk about GPP strategy a little bit. I actually had a My Fantasy Fix subscriber. I was talking to him via email all day today about GPP strategy. And what I typically do is I establish a core of probably 3 to 4 plays that are going to be in the majority of my GPP lineups. Typically, those core plays are not quarterbacks. They're going to be running backs. They're going to be wide receivers. They're going to be a mix of maybe some chalky plays and then maybe a couple plays that aren't going to be as highly owned, but I'm going to have those same 4 guys in all of my lineups, and then I'm going to mix and match around them because the idea is I have high confidence in that core set of players, but then the rest of the players I'm kind of interchanging, wheeling is to use your terminology there, and I'm kind of mixing and matching, and that way if my core goes off, I'm in a really good spot because then if I can get my lineup to match up, one of my other lineups to match up where they all hit, then I'm in a really good situation. So it's a riskier play than doing all different kinds of GPP lineups just from a boom or bust standpoint, but I think it actually gives you a much better chance of winning a tournament because if you hit on your core, you have a great probability of it definitely cashing and potentially finishing near the top.
Is that core usually built up of more chalky players, or are you looking for a little bit of volatility there as well?
It really depends on the week. It depends on the slate. It depends on a lot of things. I mean, if there's an obvious chalky value play where he's going to be low cost, he's in a really good matchup, he's going to see a ton of opportunities, he's in a high-scoring game, kind of that 3-legged stool we talked about at My Fantasy Fix.
Right.
If he checks the box on all those and he's cheap, he's probably going to be in that core because I want to be able to get exposure to him because I know the rest of the field is probably going to get exposure. Now, when you talked about last week with Le'Veon Bell, he was a guy who he wasn't cheap, so you really don't get a salary advantage by rostering him. Yes, he was in a great spot. Yes, we thought he was going to get a ton of opportunities. Yes, the Vegas was in his favor, but he wouldn't necessarily be in my core because he's not saving me that money. So it really just depends. Like I think a guy like Devontae Freeman is the type of guy who rarely is really highly owned, but he has that super high potential that if I like the matchup he's in, just because that timeshare that he could potentially get with Tevin Coleman usually drives his ownership down, he's a guy who I might stick in that core where I feel pretty good about him. I think his ownership level isn't going to be super low, but I don't think it's going to be super high either. That's the type of guy who I would probably pay in the higher end.
All right, we talked about Cam Newton in cash games because of the matchup. We'll go back to the cash games in a little bit, but while we're talking tournament, quarterback tournament plays this week with things that you like and maybe a value pick or a little one you got a feeling about.
Yeah, I mean, a perfect example of a guy who kind of slings that ball around and can run into a really big day, Matt Stafford, and he's going into New Orleans. We know that New Orleans is the type of defense that can give up a lot of big plays via the pass. We know that Drew Brees plays better at home. This just has the makings of a shootout written all over it.
Yeah, the Saints will pressure the score and keep Detroit throwing the ball.
Keep your foot on the gas and just keep going. So I think that's a situation that I like. Another situation that I'm interested in is Carson Palmer against Tampa Bay. I think a lot of people got burned by Carson Palmer last week against Philadelphia, and I think people really suffer from recency bias in DFS. I think people really take it personally when their quarterback or one of their players do not perform as they expected them to in the previous week. So I think Carson Palmer, I'm going to go back to him this week against Tampa Bay, who we know teams just throw against. I think that's a really interesting matchup for him, and he's really cheap.
Most targets allowed per game, Tampa Bay 41.7. Philadelphia was second at 38.8. There's a significant margin. Teams are throwing against Tampa Bay. They're throwing early and often.
Yes, they are. And you know what? His wide receiver is what I really like about him. Obviously, we know John Brown. He's healthy. He is that deep threat. But Jaron Brown is also a deep threat. He's racking up a ton of his yardage on deep passes, and a huge chunk of his percentage of routes that he's running are on deep passes. So not only are you getting that, he's obviously in a good matchup, but you have the weapons there to really put up big numbers. So a lot to like there in Arizona this week in tournaments.
All right, back to the cash games. We have Cam Newton against Philadelphia, the second most targets allowed per game in the NFL behind Tampa Bay at 38.8. Who else do you like in cash games this week?
Yeah, cash games. I think it's a balance, and obviously Tom Brady. I think at the top, I think he remains one of the safer options. Now, keep in mind, the Jets and Patriots always have
Yeah.
this thing where it just seems like they never put up a huge day, and the Jets just have a way to play the Patriots well. So
It's a
I'm a
divisional
little,
game. It's an NFL
yeah.
divisional game. These two teams know each other pretty well.
Yeah, so I'm a little nervous to pay that type of salary for Tom Brady, even though he projects as our top quarterback this week at Fantistics. I think I'd rather go down a little bit, and depending upon, again, this is going to depend largely on the slate of which you're playing on, because they're not. It's not going to be available on all the slates. But if you're playing that Thursday night slate, like we mentioned with Carolina and Philadelphia, the Monday night game this week is Tennessee and Indianapolis. And if you're playing that game, I think Marcus Mariota is very much in that conversation. I fully expect him to be back this week for the team. And, Indianapolis, as we know, has really, really struggled in the secondary this week or this year. So I think Mariota is definitely in play on that slate. But main slate action, Jameis Winston, the other quarterback in that Carson Palmer game, I think he's actually cash game viable this week. They also have a ton of weapons. You look at, Deshaun Jackson can stretch that defense. Mike Evans obviously is going to take up a ton of attention from Patrick Peterson. I think that's going to open it up for guys like Adam Humphries, Deshaun Jackson, Cameron Brate. I think Jameis Winston's going to be in for a really good day, and I don't mind playing him in cash games because he allows me to save some money. He's just $7,800 on FanDuel this week, and that's really important because as we talk about in later podcasts, we're going to need that money to spend up at other positions. And in fact, he's actually our number one ranked player on DraftKings as well. When all things considered, all said and done, he's just $6,200 over there.
We'll also discuss this a little bit more in our wide receiver and tight end podcast. Head on over to the National Fantasy Pregame Show to catch that. We're also posting these on myfantasyfix.com on the front page as well, so you can get them there as well. Newly redesigned My Fantasy Fix page, by the way. It looks great.
Yeah, it looks wonderful, and we've also been trying to add a lot of free content this year as well. A lot of free articles. We talk about that three-legged stool. We have articles that go into more details each week on that three-legged stool. So check that out as well.
myfantasyfix.com. What I wanted to get at was not only at Tampa Bay and Philadelphia are allowing the most targets per game, they're also allowing the most targets per game to wide receivers. And again, we'll talk about this on the wide receiver podcast. Head on over to the page and check it out. But Cam Newton and Carson Palmer, how about stacks there?
Yeah, again, I talked about when you're doing a tournament stack, what you want to look for are those guys who can stretch that field, who are going to see those deep plays. So I think John Brown and Jaron Brown are the two guys that I'd probably consider stacking with Carson Palmer, just because they're the guys who are going to see those big time plays. Larry Fitzgerald is good. He's fine. And I think people are going to also feel kind of burned by him because last few weeks in cash, he seems like the obvious answer, and he hasn't come through. So, again, recency bias is in your favor. I think his ownership level is going to be low. But, if I'm talking about best bang for your buck, going down and just stacking a Carson Palmer and the two Browns, I don't mind doing that. I prefer to pick one or the other. I don't want to do a 3-player stack typically. So I'd probably lean maybe getting half and half exposure to each of the Browns.
All right, that's our quarterback podcast for week 6. Before you head on over to the National Fantasy Pregame Show and check out our running back podcast and our wide receiver tight end podcast, head on out to Kroger's if you have one locally. Or go to Amazon.com, order yourself up some Nolan Ryan beef jerky. Help our sponsors out, the official beef jerky of Major League Clubhouse managers. Head on over to Fantistics and InsiderFootball.com to help dominate your season-long NFL fantasy play. There's also a lot of things that will help you in DFS there as well, but MyFantasyFix.com, check that out. Again, newly redesigned. You're going to like it. You can find our podcast there. You can find free content on various things throughout the week, and check out single-week subscriptions and single-week look-ins and year-long subscriptions for premium content. That's the place to go, myfantasyfix.com. That's the quarterback podcast. Again, the National Fantasy Pregame Show. Go give us a like over on Facebook, and you'll know when we post all of our other podcasts. Look for the running back podcast and the wide receiver podcasts, and we'll see you next time.